10,000 years ago, beside a vast African lake, an entire group of men, women, and children met a violent end. Stone projectiles pierced their bodies, skulls were shattered, and no one returned to bury the dead. Was this a sudden massacre, a raid over valuable resources, or the earliest evidence of organized war in human history? Before we uncover what happened at Nataruk, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more mysteries from humanity's forgotten past. The ground is pale, dry, and almost empty. Yet beneath this northern Kenyan surface, a human story has remained undisturbed for nearly 10,000 years. A fragment of bone appears first, then another. What follows is not the orderly geometry of a cemetery, but the scattered remains of people who seem to have fallen where their lives ended. Some lie face down, others on their sides or backs. Several bones carry wounds that did not heal. One skull contains a small piece of stone driven deep enough to remain there across the millennia. The place is called Nataruk, and what emerges from its ancient sediments looks disturbingly like the aftermath of violence. Today, Nataruk stands in a dry region several kilometers from the modern lakeshore. 10,000 years ago, the water lies much closer. Lake Turkana is larger, and the place where the bodies are found forms part of a fertile lagoon system. Reeds fringe shallow water rich with fish, while hippopotamuses, antelope, and other animals move through the surrounding wetlands and grassland. To human groups moving through the region, this is not an empty wilderness. It is a landscape rich enough to revisit, and perhaps rich enough to defend. The dead are discovered during fieldwork in 2012 by researchers investigating early human life around the Turkana Basin. Careful excavation eventually identifies the fragmentary remains of at least 27 individuals. 12 skeletons preserve enough anatomical connection for researchers to study the positions in which bodies settled. The group includes men and women, adults, adolescents, and children. One woman appears to have been in the later stages of pregnancy. The presence of different ages and both sexes complicates any simple image of two bands of warriors meeting in formal combat. These people look more like a small community or traveling group overtaken by something sudden. Shallow lagoon sediments cover the bodies before animals and weather scatter them completely. Over time, the lagoon retreats and the landscape dries. What was once wet ground becomes buried memory. There is no clear sign that survivors return to dig graves or arrange the dead. No burial pits contain them, and no deliberate positioning gives the scene the calm order found in many prehistoric cemeteries. Several bodies seem abandoned in attitudes shaped by collapse, injury, or moving water. What survives in the record suggests not ceremony, but interruption. That interruption is written into the bones. At least 10 of the 12 more complete skeletons show injuries interpreted as evidence of violent death. Skulls carry fractures caused by heavy blows. Some wounds have the sharp form expected from stone-tipped weapons. A projectile remains embedded in one cranium. Another stone fragment is found near a different individual's ribcage. Knees, hands, ribs, and necks preserve damage that may have occurred around the time of death. Clubs may have struck at close range, while arrows, spears, or other projectiles may have been used from farther away. The attack, if that is what happened, may have begun at a distance and ended among bodies on the ground. Yet Nataruk does not provide a complete scene frozen like an image. Archaeology rarely offers that certainty. Sediments shift, bones break, and water rearranges objects. Scholars still debate whether all the individuals died in the same episode, whether every reported injury was caused by weapons, and whether the geology supports the original reconstruction in every detail. The word massacre carries emotional force, while the word war carries an even larger burden. A massacre may be one terrible encounter. War implies an organized pattern of hostility between groups. Nataruk preserves bodies, wounds, and a place, but not the attacker's intentions. Even so, the scene is difficult to explain as ordinary death. There is no obvious natural disaster that accounts for the concentrated trauma. The inclusion of women and children suggests indiscriminate killing or an attack on a whole traveling group. The absence of burial suggests that no one remained able or safe enough to care for the dead. One adult's hand position has been interpreted as possible restraint, although the evidence remains incomplete. The pregnant woman's presence strips away the abstraction. Whatever happened here did not involve only armed men, it reached into the future of the group itself. Before we go deeper, Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, Nataruk matters because of the kind of people involved. They lived long before cities, states, standing armies, written borders, and agricultural estates. They are hunter-gatherers, people often imagined as mobile enough to avoid sustained competition over land or wealth. Some scholars have argued that organized warfare develops only when communities become settled. Accumulate surplus and claim territory, Nataruk appears to push against that explanation. Its dead belong to a world without farms, yet they may have been killed in a coordinated encounter between communities. The distinction is crucial. Individual murder reaches deep into prehistory. A planned attack by one community upon another is different, especially when attackers carry multiple weapons and strike people of varied ages. If Nataruk represents such an event, then the capacity for something resembling warfare exists among mobile foragers under particular conditions. It does not mean all hunter-gatherers are constantly violent. It does not prove that war is inevitable. It means only that a society without agriculture can still reach a point where another group becomes a collective target. Around the dead lies a productive environment, abundant food, and perhaps more people moving through the same desirable places. Richness can reduce conflict by feeding many, but it can also create locations worth controlling. Fishing grounds, watering points, useful plants, and seasonal routes may become centers of competition. The people at Nataruk may carry resources that attract raiders. They may be crossing land claimed by others. They may be caught in a cycle of retaliation whose earlier episodes have vanished. No single explanation fully accounts for the evidence, because motives do not fossilize. What remains is the final stillness, bodies settling beside a lagoon, sediment gathering over broken bone, and the water slowly withdrawing from the place. Thousands of years pass before erosion opens the ground again. By then, the attackers are gone, the survivors are gone, and even the lake has moved away. Only the injuries remain to suggest that on this green prehistoric shore, a group of human beings encounters not an animal predator or natural catastrophe, but other human beings carrying weapons. To understand why, the story must widen beyond the dead and return to the changing African world that gathered people around water, opportunity, and danger. The violence at Nataruk does not emerge from a timeless wilderness. It belongs to a world in motion, shaped by one of the most dramatic environmental transformations in recent human history. Only a few thousand years earlier, much of northern and eastern Africa is colder and drier than it is during the age of the Nataruk dead. The final centuries of the Ice Age bring unstable rainfall, shrinking water sources, and landscapes that repeatedly change character. Human groups survive by remaining flexible, moving between rivers, lakes, uplands, and seasonal hunting grounds as conditions demand. Then the climate begins to shift. As global temperatures rise after the last glacial period, rainfall patterns across Africa change, monsoon systems strengthen, lakes expand, rivers flow more reliably, and vegetation spreads into regions that had once been sparse. This transformation does not occur everywhere at the same time or with equal intensity, but across broad areas the continent becomes wetter, grasslands push into form a desert, wetlands form in basins that had long held little water, animals follow the vegetation, and human communities follow both. The Turkana Basin responds powerfully to these changes. Fed by rivers descending from the Ethiopian highlands and surrounding regions, Lake Turkana rises above its modern level. The shoreline advances into low-lying areas, creating bays, lagoons, marshes, and channels. Places that are now dusty plains become productive waterside habitats. Fish move through the shallows, water birds gather among reeds, hippopotamuses and crocodiles occupy the margins, antelope, wild cattle, and other grazing animals travel through nearby grasslands. For mobile human groups, this new environment offers something rare in a difficult world: several kinds of food concentrated in one place. Fishing becomes especially important. Archaeological sites around African lakes and rivers preserve fish bones, harpoons, stone tools, and other traces of communities that know how to exploit aquatic environments. Some groups produce finely worked bone points, possibly used in fishing or hunting. Nets, baskets, wooden shafts, and plant fiber cords may also be part of daily life, although such materials rarely survive. The absence of these objects from the archaeological record does not mean they were absent from the shore. It means that stone and bone preserve a distorted image of a much richer technology. A lagoon can provide fish during one season, water plants during another, and access to game throughout the year. Shellfish, bird eggs, turtles, and small animals add further possibilities. Nearby trees and shrubs supply fruits, seeds, wood, fibers, and shade. Such abundance may allow people to remain in one area longer than earlier generations could. They are still mobile hunter-gatherers, but mobility is not a single way of life. Some groups travel constantly across wide territories. Others return repeatedly to the same favoured camps. A community may stay near water for weeks or months before moving with the seasons. These repeated visits gradually alter the meaning of place. A shoreline is no longer merely a point on a route. It becomes a familiar landscape filled with remembered paths, productive fishing spots, old hearths, burial places, and stories attached to particular trees or ridges. Children grow up learning where animals cross, where reeds are easiest to cut, and where shallow water traps fish as the level falls. Knowledge accumulates across generations. The land remains open in the modern sense. Without surveyed borders or written ownership, yet it is not socially empty. This is one of the most important conditions surrounding Netarok. As wetter environments support more food, they can also support more people. Population density remains extremely low compared with later farming societies, but even a modest increase may matter when groups depend on the same narrow zones of water and vegetation. In dry country, human movement often converges on reliable springs, lake margins, and river corridors. Two communities may occupy enormous territories, yet still meet repeatedly at the few places where resources are concentrated. Most meetings do not end in violence. Exchange, marriage, shared ritual, mutual assistance, and the movement of knowledge are essential parts of hunter-gatherer life. Stone from distant geological sources often appears far from where it was collected, showing that objects and materials travel through networks connecting different groups. People exchange toolstone, ornaments, foods, information, and partners. These relationships reduce isolation and help communities survive local shortages. Cooperation is not a sentimental addition to human history. It is one of the main reasons small populations endure. The same networks, however, can carry tension. A failed marriage arrangement, a killing, a theft, or an insult may create obligations of revenge. Access to a productive fishing area may become disputed during a difficult season. Outsiders may arrive in numbers that threaten a group already using the shore. Mobile societies do not need permanent villages to possess territorial expectations. Ethnographic studies of more recent hunter-gatherers reveal an enormous range of behaviour, from relatively peaceful coexistence to recurring feuds and organised raids. These modern examples cannot simply be projected backward, but they demonstrate that mobility does not eliminate conflict. The environment itself also changes from year to year. A lake may be large across centuries while individual seasons remain unpredictable. Rain can fail, fish populations can shift, animal migrations can move away from familiar routes, flooding may destroy a camp, while falling water exposes new land and closes old channels. Abundance and instability coexist. A productive location becomes especially valuable because the wider landscape cannot always be trusted. What survives in the record suggests that early Holocene communities around Turkana possess detailed ecological knowledge and technologies adapted to this fluid world. They know how to process fish, butcher animals, shape stone, work bone, and move across varied terrain. Their lives are not primitive rehearsals for agriculture. They are complete social worlds built around observation, memory, and flexibility. Yet the archaeological record preserves only fragments of their relationships. A concentration of tools may represent a household camp, a seasonal gathering, or repeated visits separated by generations. The evidence remains incomplete because everyday social boundaries leave few durable traces. Even human remains can be difficult to interpret. A lone skeleton may belong to a burial, an accident, or an abandoned death. Several skeletons may result from disease, flood, conflict, or the reuse of a place over centuries. At Netarok, the combination of traumatic injuries and body positions makes violence the leading explanation, but the larger setting gives that violence possible context. The dead lie within a landscape where people, resources, and movement increasingly intersect. The warming climate does not invent aggression, nor does abundance automatically create war. Instead, it creates new opportunities and new pressures at the same time. Larger lakes draw communities together. Productive shores encourage longer stays. Familiar places acquire social value. More frequent encounters create more possibilities for friendship, exchange, competition, and revenge. In this setting, a single dispute can become attached to a location that matters deeply to more than one group. Netarek may therefore record not a random eruption of brutality, but a danger produced by connection. The same rich landscape that sustains life brings people within reach of one another. The same lake that feeds families concentrates movement along its edges. Before weapons strike bone, climate reshapes the map, water gathers communities, and a green African world quietly creates the conditions in which cooperation and conflict can both grow. Far beyond the Turkana shore, the same climatic transformation is remaking an entire continent. The Sahara, now imagined as the purest expression of emptiness, is not yet the desert known today. Across immense regions, grasslands spread between shallow lakes, seasonal rivers, wooded valleys, and marshes as alive with birds. Hippopotamuses swim in waters that will one day vanish beneath dunes. Herds move through plains now crossed only by wind. Human communities leave behind hearths, tools, fish bones, rock art, and graves in places where permanent settlement would later become almost impossible. This wetter interval, usually called the African humid period, creates one of the strangest lost landscapes in human history. Its cause begins far beyond Africa. Slow changes in Earth's orbit alter the seasonal distribution of sunlight, strengthening the summer heating of the northern hemisphere. The contrast between hot land and cooler ocean intensifies the African monsoon. Drawing moist air farther north, rain reaches deep into regions that receive almost none today. Vegetation then reinforces the transformation. Grass and shrubs darken the surface, helping it absorb more heat than pale sand. While soils and wetlands retain moisture, dust in the atmosphere declines, allowing climatic patterns to shift still further. No single mechanism acts alone, and scholars still debate the timing and regional complexity, but the result is unmistakable. Desert becomes savanna, dry basins become lakes, and human movement expands into a newly habitable world. This Green Sahara is never one continuous garden. Dry zones remain, rainfall fluctuates, and some regions are far more productive than others. Yet corridors open between areas previously separated by extreme aridity. People can move across northern Africa through networks of rivers, springs, pasture, and seasonal lakes. Animals spread with them. Ideas, tool-making traditions, ornaments, and social customs travel over long distances. The prehistoric continent becomes linked by landscapes that later disappear so completely that their former existence seems almost unbelievable. Rock paintings preserve faint impressions of this world. Some show wild cattle, giraffes, elephants, hunters, swimmers, and groups gathered around animals. The images belong to different periods and cannot be treated as a single documentary record, but together they reveal environments profoundly unlike the modern desert. One of the most surprising details is the presence of aquatic scenes, far from any major water source today. Human figures appear to float or swim through spaces now dominated by bare stone and sand. Whether every figure represents literal swimming remains debated, but the art reflects a cultural memory formed in proximity to water. Water does more than make travel possible. It creates focal points. A shallow lake in a vast grassland may draw fishers, hunters, gatherers, and migrating animals from many directions. Some groups arrive only briefly. Others return season after season. Camps form along beaches and river mouths. Fires burn beside piles of open shells and butchered fish. Children learn the shape of a shoreline that their descendants may still visit generations later. The landscape appears broad and open. But useful places are unevenly distributed. A lake rich in fish is more valuable than a dry plain. A reliable spring matters more than 100 kilometers of uncertain ground. As these places become familiar, they also acquire memory. People bury relatives near certain shores. They mark routes with stories. Particular trees, islands, ridges, or pools become associated with ancestors and events. Territory does not need fences to exist. It can be made from knowledge and expectation who may fish here, who has marriage ties nearby, who must ask permission, and who is considered a stranger. None of these rules survives directly in the ground. But human societies do not require writing to create social maps. The richer environment may allow communities to grow. Reliable aquatic foods provide calories and protein with less risk than large game hunting alone. Fish can sometimes be caught in numbers, especially when water levels fall and channels narrow. Seeds, tubers, fruits, and small animals broaden the diet. At certain times of year, people may possess more food than they can consume immediately. Drying or smoking fish could extend its usefulness. Although direct evidence is often difficult to preserve, containers made from hide, wood, bark, or woven fibre may permit transport and storage. Archaeology finds mostly stone and bone, but the true material world is likely filled with perishable objects that disappear. Even limited storage changes the possibilities of human interaction. A group carrying dried fish, animal fat, stone, ornaments, or carefully made tools possesses resources that can be shared, traded, stolen, or defended. Wealth remains modest by the standards of later villages, yet it does not have to be enormous to attract attention. A few days of food may determine whether a family survives a failed hunt. A bundle of rare toolstone may represent weeks of travel or valuable social connections. The idea that hunter-gatherers have nothing worth fighting over underestimates both the uncertainty of their lives and the importance of portable resources. Still, abundance does not lead automatically to violence. The African humid period also expands the space available to people. New grasslands and lakes can reduce pressure by allowing populations to disperse. Communities may avoid enemies simply by moving elsewhere. Marriage ties connect distant groups, while ceremonies and seasonal gatherings create opportunities for exchange. Cooperation is often more useful than attack, particularly in environments where knowledge from neighbours can save lives. A stranger may know where rain has fallen, where animals are moving, or where a river still flows. The danger increases when movement becomes constrained. A lake may shrink during a dry phase, concentrating fish, animals, and people along a smaller shoreline. A once reliable marsh may disappear. Groups that previously used separate territories may converge on the same remaining water. Climate records show that the humid period is not uniformly wet. It contains abrupt fluctuations, regional droughts, and generations of instability. A landscape can appear generous across millennia, while still delivering severe shortages within a human lifetime. This rhythm of expansion and contraction may shape conflict more powerfully than either abundance or scarcity alone. During good years, populations increase and communities spread. When conditions worsen, the same number of people must rely on fewer productive places. Old understandings about access may break down. Visitors may be treated as intruders. A killing committed during one confrontation may demand revenge during the next. Violence becomes part of memory, passed through people rather than written records. Nataruk lies within this larger climatic world. Its lagoon is one small piece of a continent covered with shifting waters and migrating communities. The people who die there may know routes extending far beyond the lake. Their stone weapons may include materials carried through exchange networks or collected from distant sources. Their attackers may not be strangers in the absolute sense. They could belong to a neighbouring group encountered many times before, connected by trade, intermarriage, rivalry or old injury. No bone can reveal whether the fatal encounter begins over fish, territory, revenge, captives, or something entirely lost. What the environment shows is that prehistoric violence does not require a barren world where starving groups fight over the last pool. It can arise in a rich landscape precisely because richness draws people together. Green plains open routes, lakes create gathering places, larger populations increase contact, memory attaches communities to particular shores. Then rainfall shifts, water retreats, or trust fails. The Sahara will eventually dry again, breaking many of these routes and pushing people towards surviving rivers and lakes. Yet at the time of Nataruk, the transformation is still unfolding. Africa is greener, wetter, and more connected than it will be for thousands of years. Beneath that apparent abundance lies a quiet attention. The more valuable a place becomes, the more human lives can be drawn toward it. and the more dangerous its ownership may become when different groups believe the same water belongs within their world. Along the enlarged shores of ancient Lake Turkana, survival depends less on raw strength than on attention. The people moving through this landscape must read water, wind, tracks, cloud, bird movement, and the changing colour of the shallows. A lagoon that produces fish one week may become too deep or too muddy the next. A herd seen on the western horizon may vanish before hunters reach it. Rain falling far away in the Ethiopian highlands can alter rivers and shorelines days or weeks later. Nothing here is truly static, and the communities living beside the lake learn to treat the environment not as scenery but as a shifting body of signs. Morning begins before the heat settles over the basin. Smoke rises from low fires built among patches of grass or beneath sparse trees. The camp may consist of temporary shelters made from branches, reeds, hides, and woven plant material. Structures light enough to abandon when the group moves. Such shelters rarely survive archaeologically, leaving only concentrations of stone flakes, burned earth, animal bone, and broken tools. The apparent emptiness of prehistoric sites is deceptive. In life, the shore is filled with baskets, wooden poles, cords, nets, mats, containers, drying racks, sharpened sticks, hides, and clothing made from materials that decay without leaving a trace. Some people move toward the water carrying fishing equipment. Bone points may serve as barbs or tips for spears, while smaller tools help cut fibre, prepare bait, or clean the catch. Fish can be taken with thrusting spears in shallow water, trapped in narrowing channels, collected from pools left behind by falling levels, or caught with methods that leave no durable evidence. Nets are especially difficult to prove. Yet they are technologically possible for communities already skilled in cordage and basketry. The evidence remains incomplete, but the richness of aquatic remains at many African sites suggests a far more complex fishing tradition than a few surviving bone harpoons alone reveal. Others leave camp to gather plants, search for eggs, collect shellfish, or follow game trails. Hunting large animals is dangerous and uncertain. Even a successful strike may lead to a long pursuit, and a wounded animal can easily injure or kill its attacker. Smaller animals offer less meat, but may be caught more reliably. Turtles, birds, hares, rodents, and reptiles all add to the diet. Tubers, fruits, seeds, and leafy plants provide foods that leave far fewer archaeological traces than bone, creating an old distortion in reconstructions of prehistoric life. Stone tools often make hunters visible, while the daily labour of gathering disappears. Food preparation occupies much of the camp's rhythm. Fish are opened with sharp flakes, meat is cut from bone, marrow is extracted, and plant foods are pounded, scraped, roasted, or soaked. A stone flake can be produced quickly from a prepared core and used until its edge dulls. Not every tool is a treasured object. Some are made for a single task and discarded within minutes. Others are reshaped repeatedly or carried over long distances. Archaeologists sometimes find stone originating far from the site where it was abandoned, suggesting movement, exchange, or both. A small blade may therefore carry the hidden geography of relationships extending well beyond the lake. Children learn through observation and participation. They gather fuel, carry water, watch adults shape tools, and imitate hunting or fishing techniques in play. Their mistakes are likely tolerated when the risks are small and corrected quickly when danger approaches. Knowledge is not stored in books or formal institutions. It lives in repeated action: how to recognize safe water where crocodiles rest, which plant roots can be eaten when a storm is forming, and what tracks indicate a predator nearby. The survival of every generation depends on transmitting this knowledge accurately while allowing enough flexibility to respond when familiar patterns fail. Older people may be particularly important. Physical endurance matters, but memory can matter more. Someone who remembers a severe drought from decades earlier may know where water persisted when other sources vanished. Someone who has travelled widely may recognize distant stone, unfamiliar speech, or the customs of neighbouring groups. Age does not guarantee authority, and social arrangements probably vary, but long experience is a resource in an unpredictable environment. A community that loses too many knowledgeable adults loses more than labour. It loses part of its map. Daily life is also social. People groom one another, repair tools, prepare food, care for injuries, tell stories, arrange partnerships, and negotiate disputes. Music, rhythm, body decoration, and ritual almost certainly exist, even when direct evidence does not survive. Ochre may colour skin, hides, wood, or objects. Beads and ornaments can signal attachment, status, age, or connection to other communities. A necklace may be beautiful, but it can also carry information about who a person is and where that person belongs. Group size probably changes throughout the year. A few related families may travel together during periods when resources are scattered. Larger gatherings become possible when fish are abundant or animals concentrate near water. These meetings allow marriages, exchanges, ceremonies, and the renewal of alliances. They also create opportunities for jealousy, competition, and the reopening of old disputes. People who normally live far apart may spend days together at the same productive shore before separating again. The community is unlikely to be isolated or culturally uniform. Individuals may join through marriage, adoption, friendship, or the aftermath of loss. A person born far from Turkana can become part of a local group while retaining knowledge and ties from elsewhere. Languages or dialects may overlap across the region, enabling communication without erasing difference. Social boundaries are flexible, but they are real. Insiders know obligations that outsiders may not understand. A visitor approaching a fishing place might be welcomed, watched cautiously, or turned away depending on relationships established long before that moment. Mobility is carefully organized rather than aimless. Camps shift in response to water levels, fish movement, grazing animals, plant seasons, illness, or social danger. Belongings must remain portable, but mobility does not mean people possess little. Their wealth lies partly in objects, yet even more in knowledge, relationships, and rights of access. A family connected to several groups can move through a wider landscape with greater security. A family cut off by conflict may find familiar routes closed. Death is part of this world, though not always treated in the same way. Some people are buried deliberately, perhaps close to camps or places of ancestral importance. Others may die far from companions, be lost during travel, or remain where recovery is too dangerous. Burial customs can differ between communities and change over time. Bodies may be placed with ornaments, covered with earth, or treated in ways that leave little visible trace. What survives in the record suggests care for the dead existed long before permanent settlement, but care was not always possible. Injuries are common even without human conflict. Falls, animal attacks, infections, burns, and accidents with stone tools can leave lasting damage. Broken bones may heal if the injured person receives food and protection, revealing the quiet importance of cooperation. Survival with serious impairment is evidence that individuals are not valued only for immediate productivity. A person unable to hunt may still teach, gather, repair equipment, care for children, or preserve memory. This makes the possibility of collective killing more disturbing. The people beside Turkana are not anonymous figures wandering through a brutal age. They belong to families, carry remembered roots, recognize familiar voices, and understand the shoreline through years of experience. Each individual represents a network of obligations and knowledge. To kill several members of such a group is not merely to remove bodies, it damages the social structure that allows the survivors to live. For most days, however, the lake offers routine rather than catastrophe. Fish dry beside the fire, stone rings against stone as new edges are struck. Children follow footprints near the reeds. Adults scan the open ground for weather, animals, and approaching people. The landscape is productive, but vigilance never disappears. Crocodiles wait in the shallows, predators move through the grass, and strangers may appear along routes that converge on the water. Some encounters end in exchange, some produce marriages or shared meals, others may carry older hostility. The people living near Nataruk understand that the shoreline connects them to a larger human world. What they cannot know is that one gathering journey or ordinary day near the lagoon will end with bodies left behind, transforming a familiar place of food and movement into one of the oldest and most unsettling scenes of violence ever recovered. The dead at Nataruk do not appear all at once. They emerge gradually from a low rise of ancient sediment, exposed by erosion in a landscape that has long since forgotten the lagoon covering them. A fragment of human bone draws attention first, followed by another nearby. As researchers examine the surface more carefully, the pattern becomes impossible to dismiss. These are not the remains of one isolated burial. Human bones lie across an area large enough to suggest several individuals, some still partly connected in the positions where soft tissue once held them together. Excavation begins cautiously. Every exposed fragment must be recorded before it is moved, because position is evidence. The angle of a limb, the depth of a skull, the relationship between a stone object and a rib can alter the interpretation of the entire site. Wind, water, animals, and thousands of years of erosion may all have disturbed the scene. Archaeologists therefore work slowly through sediment that once formed the margin of a shallow body of water, documenting not only bones but soil layers, shells, animal remains, and the geological history surrounding them. The final count reaches at least 27 people. 12 preserve enough connected skeletal material to be treated as relatively complete individuals. The rest are represented by partial remains scattered through the deposit. Some may have been separated by erosion. Others may lie beyond the excavated area. The number 27 is therefore a minimum rather than a complete census of everyone who died there. What survives in the record suggests a substantial group. But the original gathering may have been larger. The dead include adult men and women, younger individuals, and children. This range matters. A burial place used over generations might naturally contain people of many ages, but Natteruk lacks the ordered graves expected from a formal cemetery. The bodies are not placed consistently. They do not share a repeated orientation. Some lie on their backs, others on their sides or stomachs. Limbs appear bent, extended, or drawn close to the torso. The irregularity gives the scene the appearance of people who came to rest where they collapsed rather than where mourners carefully arranged them. Several individuals seem to have fallen in positions that preserve the suddenness of death. One adult lies face down with the body twisted. Another rests on the side with arms positioned near the head. Some skeletons are incomplete because erosion has removed parts of them, while others have shifted slightly as water and sediment moved around the bodies. These processes make reconstruction difficult. A posture that appears unnatural may reflect injury, restraint, decomposition, or later disturbance. Scholars still debate how much of the original scene remains intact. One of the most haunting individuals is an adult woman found with the remains of a late-term fetus in the region of her abdomen. The small bones are fragile and incomplete, but their position suggests she was pregnant when she died. She is not an abstract victim added to a numerical count. Her body carries evidence of another life that had not yet entered the world beyond her. The discovery also confirms that the group was not composed only of hunters or fighters moving separately from their families. Children are present as well. Their bones are more delicate and less likely to survive, yet enough remains endure to show that younger members of the community died at the same place. The inclusion of children changes the emotional and social scale of the event. Whatever happened did not merely remove several adults capable of carrying weapons, it affected dependents, caregivers, family lines, and the future stability of the group. Even survivors who escaped would have faced the loss of relatives, knowledge, protection, and trust. No clear grave cuts surround the skeletons. In deliberate burial, people usually disturb the ground, place the body in a prepared space, and refill the pit. Such actions often leave visible changes in soil colour, texture, or structure. At Natteruk, the bodies appear embedded within natural lagoon deposits rather than lowered into separately dug graves. Sediment accumulates around them through environmental processes. This supports the idea that they remain exposed or only partly submerged until the landscape gradually covers them. The absence of burial is not proof of violence by itself. People can remain unburied after floods, accidents, disease outbreaks, or deaths far from companions. A group might also follow mortuary customs that do not involve digging graves. Yet when many people of varied ages lie together without orderly placement, the lack of burial becomes harder to separate from the possibility of catastrophe. Someone appears unable or unwilling to return and care for them. The setting adds another complication. Natteruk is not a dry battlefield at the time of death. It lies near shallow water, probably along the edge of a lagoon connected to the larger Turkana system. Bodies falling into mud or water behave differently from those left on firm ground. Some may float briefly, rotate, or settle as water levels change. Limbs can shift during decomposition. Smaller bones may move away. The positions seen by archaeologists are therefore not exact photographs of the final seconds. These are the result of death followed by natural transformation. Researchers use the sediment itself to reconstruct this process. Fine deposits, aquatic shells, and the shape of the ancient shoreline indicate a calm, shallow environment rather than a fast river capable of carrying bodies from far or stay away. This matters because one alternative explanation is that remains from different places or times washed together. The geological evidence has been interpreted as supporting local deposition, although critics have questioned aspects of that reconstruction. No single explanation fully accounts for every detail. Dating the site is equally important. Radiocarbon measurements and comparisons with associated materials place the remains broadly around 10,000 years ago, during the early Holocene. Exact dates vary because freshwater environments can complicate radiocarbon results. Carbon moving through ancient lake systems may appear older than it truly is, a problem known as the reservoir effect. Researchers must compare several lines of evidence rather than trust one measurement in isolation. Even with these uncertainties, the site clearly belongs to a world long before farming villages and states dominate this region. Stone tools and fragments occur around the bodies. Some are ordinary traces of life near the lagoon, objects that may have been discarded during earlier or later visits. Others appear closely associated with the dead. Distinguishing between these categories is crucial. A sharp stone found near a skeleton is not automatically a weapon. It may be a tool carried by the victim, debris already lying on the ground, or an object moved by sediment. Only when stone is embedded in bone or linked securely to an injury does its meaning become more direct. Animal bones, shells, and other remains show that humans repeatedly use the broader landscape. Nataruk may have been a camp, a stopping place, a fishing area, or part of a route along the ancient shore. The dead may have known it well. They may have arrived carrying food, tools, and children, expecting another ordinary period beside the water. Their presence need not indicate that they were fleeing or preparing for conflict. Disaster often enters places that had previously felt familiar. There are no surviving names, no possessions clearly identifying separate families, and no sign telling archaeologists where the group came from. The skeletons reveal biological differences in age, sex, health, and stature, but they do not preserve language or allegiance. Chemical analysis might eventually offer clues about diet and mobility, yet even that would provide probabilities rather than personal histories. The people remain individuals and strangers at the same time. What makes Nataruk extraordinary is not simply the number of bodies. Prehistoric cemeteries can contain many more. It is the combination of scattered placement, absence of formal burial, demographic variety, and evidence that several lives ended abruptly. The lagoon seems to have received them not as honoured ancestors, but as abandoned dead. As the excavation progresses, that impression becomes darker. The skeletons are not merely disordered. Bone after bone begins to show damage that appears to have occurred before or around the moment of death. A skull is fractured. Another contains stone. A knee is shattered. The bodies beside the vanished lake are about to reveal not only that they died together, but how violently human hands may have brought that gathering to an end. The injuries at Nataruk transform a puzzling accumulation of bodies into something far more difficult to dismiss. Human bones can fracture during life, at the moment of death, under sediment pressure, or long after burial when erosion exposes them. The task is therefore not simply to find damage, but to determine when it occurred and what caused it. Archaeologists examine fracture edges, impact patterns, colour differences, and the relationship between wounds and surrounding bone. Fresh bone bends and splinters differently from dry bone, and a blow delivered while tissue is still alive often leaves a pattern unlike damage caused thousands of years later. Several skulls at Nataruk carry lesions interpreted as perimortem trauma. One adult male has a deep fracture across the front and side of the cranium, consistent with a heavy impact from a blunt object. Another individual shows damage near the temple, one of the skull's most vulnerable areas. Such wounds could be produced by clubs, stones, or heavy wooden weapons. Wood rarely survives in the sediments, so the weapon itself is absent, but the bone preserves the force transmitted through it. A carefully aimed strike to the head is difficult to explain as an ordinary accident beside a lagoon. The clearest evidence comes from stone found in direct association with the skeletons. In one case, a sharp fragment remains lodged within a cranial cavity. It appears to have entered through the skull with enough force to penetrate bone and stay embedded. Its shape has been interpreted as part of a projectile, perhaps an arrow or spear point. Another stone object is found near the chest of a different individual, where it may have entered soft tissue even if the surrounding bone preserves no clear impact. Because flesh disappears, many fatal wounds leave no skeletal mark. A projectile passing between ribs or piercing an organ may kill without touching bone. This creates a grim imbalance in the evidence. The injuries visible to archaeologists are probably only a fraction of those sustained. Stone tips can miss the skeleton entirely. Wooden spears and clubs can damage organs without leaving permanent traces. Cuts through muscle vanish with decomposition. What remains is not a complete catalogue of wounds, but the small portion durable enough to cross 10 millennia. The lower body of one individual preserves severe damage around the knee. The joint appears fractured in a manner consistent with a powerful blow. Such an injury may have occurred while the person was attempting to flee or already lying on the ground. A shattered knee would immediately reduce mobility, leaving the victim unable to escape across mud, reeds, or shallow water. Other skeletons show injuries to hands, ribs, and upper limbs. Damage to the hands can sometimes reflect a defensive reaction, although this interpretation must remain cautious. A broken forearm is not automatically evidence of combat. The distribution of wounds matters as much as their form. Trauma appears across several adults rather than in one unusually injured person, and it affects both men and women. The concentration of head injuries suggests deliberate targeting, because blows to the skull are an efficient way to incapacitate or kill. The apparent use of both projectiles and close-range weapons suggests more than one phase of violence. Attackers may have first launched arrows or thrown spears, then approached with clubs, stones, or cutting tools. That reconstruction is plausible, but the evidence remains incomplete, and not every researcher accepts every wound identification. Some fractures may have been produced after burial. Sediment pressure can crush thin bones. Exposure to water and repeated drying can weaken them. Hooves, heavy animals, and erosion can also cause damage. Critics of the massacre interpretation have therefore argued that several reported lesions are ambiguous. They also question whether stone pieces near bodies can always be linked directly to weapons, at a place repeatedly visited by humans. Sharp debris may already have been scattered across the shore. Yet certain injuries are much harder to explain naturally. Stone embedded within bone does not arrive there because a skeleton lies beneath sediment. Depressed skull fractures require concentrated force. Multiple individuals with possible perimortem trauma in the same deposit create a pattern ordinary erosion struggles to produce. No single wound proves a massacre, but together they form a cumulative case. Archaeological interpretation often depends not on one perfect clue, but on several imperfect clues pointing in the same direction. The weapons reveal something about preparation. A projectile point must be shaped, fixed to a shaft, and carried ready for use. A club requires less specialized production, but still represents an object selected for force. If several attackers use different weapons, the assault may have involved coordination, even if only at the level of a small raiding party. Organized violence does not require ranks, commanders, or battle lines. A group can plan an ambush and choose a moment when families are vulnerable without possessing anything resembling an army. There is another silence in the bones, almost no healing. Injuries connected to the event show no sign that victims lived long enough for repair to begin. Bone healing takes time, and even its earliest response requires survival beyond the initial trauma. The absence of change supports the conclusion that these wounds were fatal or inflicted very close to death. Some people may have died immediately. Others may have remained alive for minutes or hours, unable to move, while the attackers left and sediment began gathering around them. The broad victim profile makes the violence especially revealing. Adult men could have been targeted as rivals or defenders, but women, adolescents, and children appear among the dead. This is not the pattern of a duel or a hunting accident. It resembles an assault upon a social group. The attackers, if the reconstruction is correct, are not merely removing immediate threats. They are destroying families and reducing the group's capacity to recover. Still, the word war must remain separate from the evidence of killing. Bones can show that people were attacked. They cannot show whether the event belonged to a prolonged conflict, a revenge raid, a dispute over resources, or a singular eruption of violence. They cannot reveal whether the victims knew their attackers or were surprised by strangers. The wounds tell the clearest part of the story while leaving motive hidden. Across the ancient shore, the pattern nevertheless becomes difficult to avoid. Projectiles arrive. Heavy blows follow, bodies fall, and no one returns to bury them. The skeletons do not preserve the sound or speed of the attack, but they retain its force, in fractured skulls, shattered joints, and stone lodged where living tissue once surrounded bone. Netaruk records the moment when human intention entered the archaeological record as violence. The final attack at Netaruk cannot be replayed with certainty, but the surviving evidence allows a narrow range of possibilities. The landscape provides the first clue. The victims are near a shallow lagoon rather than inside a fortified settlement or formal camp enclosed by structures. Reeds, mud, open water, and patches of firm ground create a broken shoreline where visibility changes from one step to the next. A group moving beside the water may see animals approaching across the grassland, yet fail to notice human figures concealed among vegetation or following a lower route along the shore. Or, the same environment that provides fish and safety from heat can also restrict escape. The people may be travelling together when the attack begins. Adults carry tools, food, fishing equipment, and perhaps infants or bundles of gathered plants. Children remain close enough to caregivers that the group moves more slowly than a hunting party. Some members may already be working at the water's edge while others rest or prepare food farther inland. There is no evidence that they expect immediate danger, if they had recognized an approaching enemy early enough. The most vulnerable people might have scattered before violence reached them. An ambush offers one possible explanation. Attackers could follow the group from a distance, wait near a familiar route, or approach under cover of reeds and uneven ground. They may know that people regularly gather at this lagoon during a particular season. The victims may also know the attackers, making their approach seem less threatening until weapons are raised. Hostility between neighbouring communities does not require every encounter to begin with immediate violence. A meeting might shift from tense negotiation to attack in seconds. Projectiles are likely among the first weapons used. Stone lodged within a skull suggests that at least one object strikes with considerable force. Other projectiles may enter soft tissue without touching bone, leaving no permanent trace. Arrows, darts, or light spears can be launched before attackers close the distance, creating confusion and injuring anyone who attempts to flee. The prehistoric weapon system remains uncertain because shafts, bindings, and wooden components have disappeared. But sharpened stone tips indicate a capacity to wound from beyond arm's reach. The first impacts may divide the group. Some people run toward open ground, while others move instinctively toward children or injured relatives. Those nearest the water may enter mud or shallow channels, only to lose speed. A person carrying a child cannot move as quickly as an unburdened attacker. Someone struck in the leg or knee may collapse almost immediately. The severe joint injury found on one skeleton fits this possibility. Although it cannot reveal whether the blow occurs during flight, close combat, or after the victim is already down. Once the distance closes, blunt weapons become more effective. Heavy wooden clubs, stones held in the hand, or thick shafts can produce the depressed and radiating fractures seen on several skulls. The head is a deliberate target. One powerful strike can end resistance, while repeated blows may reflect urgency, fear, anger, or an intention to make survival impossible. Cutting tools and stone-tipped spears add further injuries. The attack no longer resembles a distant exchange of missiles. It becomes physical, close, and chaotic. The victims are unlikely to stand together in a formal line. Adults may attempt to resist, but some possess only ordinary tools rather than weapons prepared for combat. A fishing spear or cutting flake can still wound an attacker, yet surprise and positioning matter more than equipment alone. If the attackers outnumber the group or control the route away from the lagoon, resistance may collapse quickly. The presence of women and children among the dead suggests either that escape routes are blocked or that the attackers intentionally pursue people who pose little immediate threat. One woman's arm position has been interpreted as evidence that her hands may have been bound. If that reading is correct, at least one victim survives the initial assault long enough to be restrained. Yet no rope remains, and natural body movement after death can imitate restraint. The claim therefore remains disputed, even without it. The irregular positions of the skeletons suggest that several people die where they fall rather than being gathered for burial or execution in one arranged location. The pregnant woman may be close to others when the violence begins. Her condition would reduce her ability to run across uneven ground. She could be struck during the attack or killed afterward when resistance has ended. There is no way to identify the precise wound that causes her death. Much of her skeleton is incomplete, and lethal damage to soft tissue leaves no visible mark. Her presence nevertheless indicates that the assault reaches people who would not normally be selected for dangerous hunting or raiding activity. Children face the same danger. Some may be killed directly, while others die from wounds, exposure, or separation after adults fall. The archaeological record cannot distinguish all these outcomes. Their remains are too fragmentary to reconstruct individual final moments. The fact that they remain at the site implies that no surviving caregivers recover them. Anyone who escapes may be wounded, pursued, or too afraid to return while attackers remain nearby. The duration of the event may be brief. A coordinated assault against an unprepared group can end within minutes, yet the consequences continue long after the weapons stop. Injured people may still breathe beside the lagoon. Attackers may search bodies, remove useful objects, or take possessions that leave no trace. Food, hides, wooden tools, ornaments, cords, and containers can all disappear with them. The relative scarcity of obvious belongings around the dead could reflect ordinary decay, looting, or the light material culture of a mobile community. Captives may also be taken. Raids in small-scale societies sometimes involve the seizure of children, partners, or adults who can be incorporated into another group. Nataruk cannot prove this occurred, but the possibility complicates the surviving count. The 27 discovered individuals may represent only those killed and abandoned. Others from the same community could escape, be captured, or die elsewhere. The archaeological scene records what remains, not the full human outcome. The attackers themselves leave almost no identifiable evidence. A weapon point found near a body might belong to them, but ordinary stone tools already lie across the landscape. No attacker's skeleton is securely recognized. They may suffer no deaths, recover their wounded, or remove fallen companions according to their own customs. This absence creates an uneven story in which the victims are visible, while the people responsible remain almost completely hidden. Even the direction of the assault cannot be established confidently. Body orientation may have changed as water and decomposition shifted limbs. Projectiles do not preserve a clear line of flight once bones move. Researchers can suggest zones of approach, but a detailed map of attackers advancing from one side would exceed what the evidence supports. Archaeological reconstruction must stop before imagination hardens into fact. What can be stated is narrower and still disturbing. A mixed group of people gathers or travels beside a productive lake margin. Several are struck by sharp and blunt weapons. The injured include adults of both sexes, and children are among the dead. Bodies remain unburied and are covered naturally by lagoon sediment. These details are consistent with a sudden assault involving more than one kind of weapon, and probably more than one attacker. Whether the event begins as an ambush, a confrontation that escalates, or the final act of an older feud remains unknown. The difference matters because each possibility implies a different social world. An ambush suggests preparation, an escalation suggests a meeting in which trust fails. Revenge suggests that the violence at Nataruk is only one episode in a sequence whose earlier dead have not been found. The bones preserve the ending without revealing the beginning. By the time the lagoon settles again, the attackers have disappeared into the wider landscape. Survivors, if any remain, carry knowledge of what happened, perhaps passing it through stories for generations. To archaeologists 10,000 years later, however, that memory is gone. Only the positions, wounds, and abandoned bodies remain, strong enough to suggest a massacre, but not yet strong enough to settle whether the shore witnessed something that should truly be called war. Calling Nataruk a battle immediately creates an image the site may not support. The word suggests opposing sides, armed participants, and at least some degree of mutual resistance. It brings to mind groups meeting with the expectation of combat, even if one side is surprised or defeated quickly. Yet the dead beside the lagoon include children, a pregnant woman, and adults who may not have been prepared to fight. Their scattered bodies look less like the remains of two forces colliding than the destruction of one vulnerable community. The distinction between battle, massacre, raid, and isolated murder is not merely a matter of language. Each term implies a different form of human organization and a different place for violence within prehistoric society. At its narrowest, the evidence demonstrates that several people died near the same ancient shoreline and that a number of them suffered severe injuries around the time of death. The stone embedded in bone, the fractured skulls, and the damaged joints make interpersonal violence highly probable. Moving beyond that conclusion requires interpretation. To call the event a massacre suggests that one group deliberately killed members of another group who were unable to defend themselves effectively. To call it warfare suggests that the assault belongs to a broader social relationship in which communities recognize one another as enemies, prepare for collective violence, and perhaps expect future retaliation. Archaeology cannot directly observe those relationships. Weapons survive, but intentions do not. A single coordinated attack may resemble warfare without being part of any continuing conflict. One group might attack another to steal food, seize people, punish a perceived offense, or avenge an earlier death. The event could be planned carefully and still remain a one-time raid rather than a war. Conversely, a small encounter involving only a few deaths might belong to a feud lasting generations. The scale of the archaeological scene does not necessarily reveal the scale of the conflict surrounding it. The meaning of organization is equally difficult to define. Modern warfare often involves formal leadership, specialized fighters, territorial states, supply systems, and declared objectives. None of these features is necessary for collective violence among small mobile groups. A dozen people can agree to attack a neighboring camp without creating a permanent military institution. They may choose a leader only for the duration of the raid. Weapons used for hunting can become weapons against humans with no change in design. Planning may consist of little more than following tracks, approaching before dawn, and striking when escape is difficult. If Nataruk records such preparation, then it represents organized violence in a basic but meaningful sense. Attackers identify a target collectively, carry weapons, coordinate their approach, and kill several members of another community. That is more than spontaneous individual aggression. It demonstrates the ability to divide the social world into those who belong and those whose lives can be taken as a group. Whether this ability deserves the label of war depends partly on how broadly the term is defined. Some researchers prefer restrictive definitions. They reserve warfare for repeated, socially approved conflict between communities, usually involving adult combatants and recognized collective goals. Under this standard, Nataruk alone cannot prove war because it preserves only one possible episode. There is no series of fortified settlements, no cemetery filled with generations of weapon injuries, and no clear pattern of repeated destruction across neighboring sites. The bodies may show a massacre, but not the larger system of hostility required to call that massacre an act of war. Others use a broader definition. They argue that warfare begins whenever members of one social group cooperate in lethal violence against members of another. Repetition may strengthen the case, but it is not essential. From this perspective, the mixed ages of the victims do not weaken the interpretation. Attacks on families can be a deliberate form of warfare because eliminating children, caregivers, and future descendants damages the entire opposing community. The absence of formal armies reflects the scale of society, not the absence of organized conflict. There is also the possibility that the site does not represent one event at all. Critics have proposed that some bodies may have accumulated over time along a shoreline used repeatedly by human groups. Water movement, erosion, and natural sedimentation could bring remains into apparent association. Injuries interpreted as weapon damage might include fractures produced after death. Stone objects found near skeletons might be ordinary tools unrelated to killing, if this alternative is correct. Nataruk could be a disturbed mortuary or habitation area rather than the frozen aftermath of an attack. The geological context becomes central to this dispute. Researchers supporting the massacre interpretation argue that the bodies were deposited locally within shallow lagoon sediments and buried during a limited period. Several articulated skeletons retain enough anatomical connection to indicate that they were not transported long distances as loose bones. A current powerful enough to gather remains from widely separated places would probably disarticulate them more extensively. The irregular positions are therefore interpreted as bodies settling naturally after death close to where they fell. Opponents answer that articulation does not prove simultaneous death. Separate individuals can enter the same stable environment at different times and still remain partly connected. Shorelines attract both living communities and the burial of their dead. A lagoon margin can preserve bodies unevenly, making events separated by years appear much closer together. Precise dating for each skeleton is difficult, and the available chronological range is not narrow enough to demonstrate that every person died on the same day. The injuries offer stronger evidence, but they also contain uncertainty. Some skull damage clearly resembles violent trauma, while other fractures are less diagnostic. Archaeologists must distinguish impact wounds from breaks caused when sediment dries, collapses, or erodes. The shape of a fracture can support a conclusion without making it absolute. Even among specialists, different observers may classify the same lesion differently. This does not mean all interpretations are equally plausible. It means that the case rests on probabilities accumulated across several bodies rather than on one unquestionable sign. The embedded projectile remains one of the most difficult clues for skeptical explanations to remove. Stone penetrating the skull strongly indicates violence. Yet one violent death does not automatically connect every surrounding skeleton to the same attack. A dangerous shoreline might witness murders, accidents, and burials across a long period. The central question is therefore not whether violence occurred at Natteruk, but whether the site preserves a single episode of collective killing. Body positions have been used to support that conclusion. Several individuals appear collapsed rather than buried. One possible restrained posture suggests capture or execution. The absence of formal graves and the varied orientations contrast with deliberate cemeteries known elsewhere. Still, mortuary behaviour can be diverse, and prehistoric communities do not always bury the dead in neat pits. Bodies might be placed in shallow water, exposed temporarily, or abandoned for reasons unrelated to attack. Scholars still debate how confidently modern expectations about burial can be applied to a society whose rituals remain unknown. The demographic pattern also cuts in two directions. Men, women, and children dying together fits a massacre of a travelling community. It could also fit a burial area serving an entire population over time. Trauma separates the two interpretations, but only if the injuries belong to enough individuals and occurred within the same event. Every conclusion returns to the same problem. Natteruk preserves many clues, yet none reveals the full relationship between the bodies. This uncertainty is not a weakness unique to the site. It is the normal condition of deep prehistory. Researchers build explanations from damaged materials left by people who never intended to create a record. The strongest interpretation must account for geology, skeletal trauma, body position, demographic range, and the surrounding material evidence with the fewest unsupported assumptions. The massacre hypothesis does this effectively, which is why it has received wide attention. The alternatives remain important because they expose where the reconstruction is strongest and where imagination might exceed the evidence. Perhaps the most careful conclusion is that Natteruk records a concentration of violent deaths highly consistent with the collective assault. It may be a battlefield only in the loosest sense because the victims do not appear to form an organised fighting force. Massacre is probably the more accurate description of the immediate scene. Whether that massacre belongs to humanity's first war cannot be established from Natteruk alone. To search for something closer to a pattern of repeated conflict, the evidence must widen beyond one vanished lagoon and turn toward other prehistoric dead whose bodies also carry stone points, healed wounds, and traces of violence returning more than once. The massacre interpretation begins not with one dramatic wound, but with the way several independent clues converge. A single fractured skull might record murder, one embedded projectile might reflect a personal dispute, a scattered body beside a prehistoric lake might result from accident, exposure, or an unfamiliar mortuary custom. At Natteruk, however, these features appear together across a mixed group of people. Supporters of the original interpretation argue that the simplest explanation is a coordinated attack in which members of one hunter-gatherer community killed members of another and left them unburied beside the lagoon. The number of injured individuals is central to this case. Trauma appears on several of the more complete skeletons, including severe blows to the skull, damage to limbs, and injuries associated with sharp stone. The wounds are not concentrated on one unusually violent death. They form a repeated pattern across the deposit. When several people in the same location suffer injuries consistent with different weapons, random accident becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. A falling tree. Animal attack or shoreline collapse does not easily explain penetrating stone, targeted cranial blows, and damage to multiple bodies. The apparent variety of weapons strengthens the argument for collective violence. Projectiles allow attackers to strike from a distance, while heavy clubs or stones become effective when the gap closes. Sharp-edged tools may be used to stab or cut. This combination suggests several attackers carrying equipment suited to different moments of an assault. Not every weapon needs to be designed exclusively for warfare. A hunting spear can be directed at a human body, and a tool used for processing food can become lethal at close range. The significance lies in their coordinated use against a group. Supporters also point to the victim's demographic range. Adult men, adult women, younger individuals, and children appear among the dead. This is not the expected result of a private quarrel involving two people, nor does it resemble a dangerous hunting expedition from which only selected adults fail to return. The broad profile suggests that an entire social unit is caught in the violence. Some adults may resist, but the attackers do not limit themselves to those capable of fighting. The assault reaches dependents and at least one pregnant woman, indicating either uncontrolled killing or a deliberate attempt to damage the opposing community beyond its immediate defenders. In small mobile societies, the destruction of a mixed group can have consequences greater than the number of bodies suggests. A community of several dozen people cannot easily absorb the loss of many adults at once. Hunters, gatherers, caregivers, toolmakers, experienced travelers, and holders of environmental knowledge may disappear in a single event. Children lose protection, while survivors lose marriage, partners, and social connections. If the dead represent a substantial portion of one traveling group, the attack may threaten the group's continued existence. The absence of burial becomes meaningful within this pattern. Communities capable of caring for their dead often do so when circumstances allow, even if their mortuary practices differ greatly from later traditions. At Nataruk, the bodies appear to remain where they fall, gradually covered by shallow water sediments. Supporters argue that this abandonment is best explained by sudden catastrophe. Survivors may have fled, been captured, or feared returning. Attackers may have remained nearby long enough to make recovery impossible. The lack of formal treatment therefore reflects not indifference, but the violent collapse of normal social obligations. The location may reveal why the group is vulnerable. A lagoon provides food and water but can trap movement between marsh, mud, and open ground. People engaged in fishing or gathering are dispersed and focused on their work. Children and belongings slow any attempt to escape. Attackers familiar with the shoreline could choose their approach carefully, using vegetation or uneven terrain for concealment, if conflict already exists between neighbouring groups. A predictable seasonal gathering place offers an opportunity for ambush. This possibility challenges older assumptions about the origins of war. Hunter-gatherers were once placed at opposite extremes in competing stories of human nature. In one version, life before farming is dominated by constant violence, and civilization gradually restrains aggression. In another, mobile foragers are largely peaceful because they possess little property and can avoid conflict simply by moving away. Nataruk fits neither simple model. It suggests that mobile communities can cooperate most of the time while still becoming capable of planned collective killing under particular social and environmental conditions. Resource competition is one possible motive, though it cannot be proven. The lagoon may concentrate fish, freshwater, useful plants, and animals within a relatively small area. During periods of changing rainfall or falling lake levels, access becomes less predictable. One group may view another's presence as trespass or theft. Portable food, stone, ornaments, tools, and other possessions could also attract raiders. The victims may be attacked for what they carry rather than for permanent control of the shore. Revenge provides another possibility. In societies without courts or central authorities, responsibility for a killing can extend beyond the individual who committed it. Relatives may be expected to retaliate, while the victim's group views failure to respond as weakness. One death produces another, and hostility becomes inherited through memory. A raid at Nataruk could therefore be an answer to an earlier event invisible to archaeology. The victims may not be chosen because of anything they personally did, but because they belong to the community held responsible. Captives might offer an additional motive. Children, young adults, or partners can be incorporated into another group, replacing population losses or creating new alliances under coercive conditions. If captives are taken, they vanish from the archaeological scene, leaving only those killed. This means the discovered bodies may represent part of the attacked group rather than its full size. The absence of certain individuals cannot reveal whether they escaped or were carried away. The massacre interpretation does not require permanent armies or specialized warriors. A raiding party may consist of ordinary hunters acting temporarily as fighters. Leadership can be informal, and the attack may be planned only days or hours in advance. What matters is collective intention. Several people identify another group as a target and cooperate in lethal action. Under a broad definition, this is already a form of warfare, even without fortifications, uniforms, or organized states. Yet responsible interpretation stops before claiming more than the site can show. Nataruk does not reveal the attacker's identity, their number, or their precise motive. It does not establish whether violence was common around Lake Turkana or exceptional enough to be remembered for generations. It cannot prove a sustained war involving repeated raids. The site offers one probable episode, not a complete political history. Even with these limits, supporters argue that the massacre hypothesis explains the evidence more coherently than the alternatives. Multiple violent injuries, different weapon types, mixed victims, irregular body positions, and natural burial within lagoon sediments together form the outline of a sudden attack. Each clue may be questioned separately, but their combination is powerful. The interpretation remains a reconstruction rather than a witnessed fact. Yet it places collective violence among hunter-gatherers thousands of years before agriculture dominates the region. The dead at Nataruk therefore stand at the center of a larger debate. They may show that organized human conflict does not begin with fields, walls, stored grain, or kings. The capacity to plan an assault, recognize another community as an enemy, and kill beyond immediate self-defense may already exist within a mobile world built around fishing, gathering, exchange, and seasonal movement. Whether the evidence is strong enough to carry that conclusion depends on how well it survives the objections raised against it. The objections to the warfare interpretation do not begin by denying that violence occurred at Nataruk. Few researchers would argue that every wound can be explained by accident or erosion. The sharper disagreement concerns the scale, timing, and unity of the event. Do the skeletons preserve the aftermath of one coordinated massacre, or have several deaths from different moments been compressed into a single archaeological scene? That distinction determines whether Nataruk can support claims about organized conflict or only demonstrate that prehistoric individuals sometimes died violently. The first challenge comes from geology. A shoreline is not a fixed surface. Water advances and retreats, channels shift, sediment is removed and redeposited, and bodies may enter the same general area over many years. Critics argue that Nataruk's ancient lagoon could have accumulated remains gradually, rather than receiving them all during one fatal episode. A person might be buried naturally after an accident, another placed nearby according to local mortuary custom, and a third killed in an unrelated confrontation generations later. Erosion could then expose them together, creating the illusion of simultaneity. Partly articulated skeletons do not completely solve the problem. When soft tissue remains, a body can settle with many bones still connected, even if it enters the sediment separately from others. Calm water and rapid burial may preserve articulation without requiring a mass death. If different individuals were deposited within the same shallow zone over decades or centuries, later geological processes could make their positions appear more closely related than they originally were. Precise dating of every skeleton would be needed to eliminate this possibility, but dating human remains from ancient lake environments is difficult. Freshwater systems can distort radiocarbon results. Carbon dissolved in a lake may come from old geological sources and enter fish, shellfish, and the people who consume them. A person whose diet depends heavily on aquatic food can therefore appear older than the true date of death. This reservoir effect complicates comparisons between individuals. Two people who died at the same time but ate different amounts of fish might produce different radiocarbon ages. Conversely, bodies from separate periods could appear closer in date than they really are. Researchers can correct for such effects only when the ancient food web and local water chemistry are understood well enough. The broad early Holocene dating of Natteruk remains secure, but the narrower chronology is less certain. The site may belong to a limited period without preserving one single day. Critics therefore caution against treating the deposit like a battlefield sealed immediately after combat. Archaeology often creates snapshots from materials that actually accumulated through time, and the more dramatic the interpretation, the more important it becomes to prove that the apparent moment is real. The injuries themselves also receive renewed scrutiny. Bone breaks in different ways depending on age, moisture, burial pressure, and later exposure. Fresh bone tends to bend and produce smoother fracture surfaces, while dry bone often breaks more irregularly. Yet ancient waterlogged bone can behave unpredictably, and erosion can remove the features used to distinguish injuries made at death from damage occurring centuries later. Some lesions originally described as perimortem trauma may therefore be less certain than they first appear. Head wounds remain among the strongest indicators of violence, especially where the fracture pattern suggests a focused impact. Even so, not every damaged skull proves an intentional blow. A body falling onto stone, being trampled by a large animal, or shifting beneath heavy sediment can produce severe fractures. Such explanations become less convincing when similar wounds appear across several individuals. But critics argue that each injury must be evaluated independently before being combined into a massacre pattern. Stone objects create another difficulty. The ancient shoreline contains tools and manufacturing debris from repeated human activity. Sharp flakes may lie naturally near skeletons without having struck anyone. A fragment found close to a rib cage might once have been carried in a pouch, discarded at an older camp, or moved slightly by water. Only the stone lodged within the skull provides an unambiguous physical connection between weapon and victim. Even there, the wound establishes one violent death, not necessarily the simultaneous killing of everyone nearby. The absence of formal graves has also been given more weight than some scholars consider justified. Prehistoric mortuary practices vary enormously. Communities may place bodies on the surface, leave them in shallow water, expose them before collecting selected bones, or abandon them in locations carrying ritual significance. A modern observer may interpret disorder as neglect when it actually reflects deliberate treatment. Without a better understanding of local customs, irregular body positions cannot automatically be equated with collapse during an attack. The possible evidence of binding illustrates the danger of overinterpretation. One individual's hands appear positioned in a way that might suggest restraint. This detail contributes strongly to the image of captives executed beside the lagoon. Yet ligaments contract, limbs shift during decomposition, and water can alter posture. No cord or binding survives. What appears to be tied wrists may simply be the final position of a body transformed by natural processes. A compelling visual detail can become more certain in retelling than the physical evidence allows. Critics also question how the site has been framed. Once Natteruk is described as humanity's earliest massacre, every object and posture risks being interpreted through that lens. A fractured knee becomes evidence of attempted escape. A face-down skeleton becomes a person struck while fleeing. A mixed-age group becomes a family ambushed at a fishing camp. Each scenario is possible, but possibility is not proof. Archaeologists must remain alert to the way a powerful narrative can organize ambiguous evidence into a story that feels complete. This caution does not require replacing the massacre with an equally elaborate alternative. The site may contain several violent deaths, some natural deaths, and perhaps bodies treated according to customs no longer understood. Human activity could have returned to the same lagoon repeatedly because it was productive, familiar, or symbolically important. A person killed in one generation might lie near someone buried peacefully in another. The resulting deposit would be complex rather than dramatic, but complexity is often what prehistoric sites preserve. The demographic mixture is also not exclusive to massacre. Men, women, and children naturally appear in cemeteries or places used repeatedly for body disposal. Their presence becomes evidence of collective killing only when simultaneity and shared cause are established. If the chronology remains broad, the varied ages may reflect an entire community's use of the location over time, rather than one community's destruction in a single attack. There is a deeper concern behind these objections. Claims about the earliest war easily become arguments about human nature. If Natteruk is accepted as proof that hunter-gatherers conducted massacres 10,000 years ago, it may be used to portray organized violence as ancient, universal, and almost inevitable. If the site is rejected, it may support the opposite belief that war arose only with property, farming, or political hierarchy. Neither conclusion follows safely from one deposit. A single prehistoric site cannot resolve whether warfare is biologically rooted or socially invented. The most careful skeptical position therefore does not declare Netarok peaceful. It recognizes strong evidence for interpersonal violence while questioning whether all the bodies belong to the same event and whether that event qualifies as war. Some individuals were almost certainly attacked. Several may have died violently. A collective massacre remains plausible, perhaps even likely, but the archaeological record is not complete enough to remove every reasonable alternative. This debate improves rather than weakens the investigation. It forces researchers to separate observation from reconstruction. A stone embedded in a skull is an observation. An ambush launched from reeds is a reconstruction. Multiple bodies are observed. A single coordinated raid is inferred. By keeping those categories distinct, Netarok remains significant without becoming more precise than the evidence permits. To decide whether prehistoric violence sometimes formed a repeated social pattern rather than an isolated event, another site becomes essential. Far to the north, near the Nile, a cemetery contains men, women, and children marked by dozens of stone projectiles. Their wounds do not appear to belong to one sudden massacre. Instead, they suggest violence returning again and again across individual lives. As communities endured a changing world in which conflict may have become not a single catastrophe, but a recurring condition. Far north of Turkana, another group of prehistoric dead lies close to a vanished shoreline. The place is Jebel Sahaba, near the Nile in what is now northern Sudan, not far from the modern border with Egypt. When the cemetery is excavated during the 1960s, archaeologists recover the remains of more than 60 people buried in shallow graves. Men, women, adolescents, and children are all present. Many lie with small stone fragments embedded in their bones or positioned where soft tissue once surrounded the body. For decades, the cemetery is described as evidence of one of the earliest known massacres. Yet closer examination eventually reveals something stranger. These people may not have died in one battle at all. Their bones suggest violence returning repeatedly over years, perhaps generations. Jebel Sahaba belongs to the end of the Pleistocene, more than 13,000 years ago, when the Nile Valley is undergoing severe climatic and environmental instability. The last ice age is ending, but the transition is not a smooth warming into abundance. Rainfall shifts unpredictably. River channels change. Deserts expand and retreat. Groups that once moved through wider territories may increasingly concentrate along the Nile and its dependable resources. Fish, water birds, plants, and animals make the river corridor attractive. But the same narrow band of life also brings communities into more frequent contact. The people buried at Jebel Sahaba are often associated with the Kardun cultural tradition, a broad archaeological label applied to hunter-gatherers living along parts of the Nile during this period. They use small stone tools, fish intensively, gather wild plants, and move through landscapes shaped by seasonal water. The label does not identify a single tribe or language. It groups together material patterns visible to archaeologists, not the names or identities people used for themselves. Their true social boundaries remain hidden. The cemetery itself demonstrates sustained attachment to place. Unlike the apparently abandoned bodies at Netarok, many individuals at Jebel Sahaba are deliberately buried. Graves sometimes contain more than one person, and some bodies are placed in flex positions. Returning to the same cemetery requires memory and social continuity. People know where earlier generations lie and choose to place new dead among them. This is not a random collection of bodies washed together by the river. It is a mortuary landscape created intentionally. Yet violence penetrates that landscape with unusual frequency. Stone projectiles are found embedded in or closely associated with numerous skeletons. Some are tiny geometric fragments capable of forming the cutting edges or points of composite weapons. A wooden shaft may carry several small stone pieces rather than one large spearhead. When such a projectile enters the body, the shaft and bindings decay, leaving only the stone behind. Some fragments remain lodged in bone, while others are discovered in positions suggesting they once rested in muscle or organs. Skulls, ribs, limbs, and other bones carry wounds consistent with sharp weapons and projectile impacts. Several individuals have injuries that show signs of healing. Bone has grown around old damage, proving that the person survived the attack long enough for repair to begin. Other wounds are unhealed and may have been inflicted at or near death. The combination is crucial. A person with both healed and unhealed injuries has encountered violence more than once. The cemetery therefore records not only deaths caused by conflict, but survivors who returned to dangerous conditions and were attacked again. This pattern changed how researchers understood the site. Earlier interpretations often presented Jebel Sahaba as the result of a single catastrophic battle or massacre. More recent reanalysis of the skeletons and stone fragments suggests repeated episodes of interpersonal violence. The injuries vary in location and stage of healing. Some people survive one attack and later die with new wounds. Not everyone is killed at the same moment. And the cemetery may have been used across a substantial period. The difference between one massacre and recurring conflict is profound. A massacre can result from a sudden dispute, a rare raid, or one unusually violent encounter. Repeated injuries imply a social environment in which attacks happen often enough to shape individual lives. People recover from wounds, return to daily routines, and later face violence again. Children grow up within communities that remember earlier killings. Adults may carry scars from encounters that demand retaliation. Conflict becomes not an isolated rupture, but an expectation woven into movement along the river. The victims include both sexes and multiple age groups, much as at Nataruk. This broad pattern suggests that attacks are not restricted to formal combat between adult men. Families may be targeted during travel, fishing, gathering, or occupation of temporary camps. Projectiles allow attackers to strike from a distance and withdraw quickly. A small raiding party can injure several people without entering prolonged close combat. Riverbanks, reeds, channels, and elevated ground create opportunities for ambush. The small size of many stone points may also reveal how weapons are used. Rather than heavy spears intended only for large animals, some projectiles may be light enough for arrows or darts. Composite points armed with multiple sharp elements can create wide wounds and remain difficult to remove. A projectile that misses bone may still sever blood vessels or puncture organs. As at Nataruk, the skeletons preserve only a fraction of the original injuries. No single motive survives. Competition over fishing locations is possible because aquatic resources become increasingly important during periods of environmental stress. Access to water, plant-rich floodplains, and reliable camps may also matter. Groups could be defending territories built around seasonal knowledge rather than fixed settlements. Revenge may transform individual killings into recurring raids, captives, marriage disputes, stolen resources, or violations of social boundaries may contribute as well. Scholars still debate how much climate pressure influenced the violence, and no single explanation fully accounts for the pattern. Environmental instability nevertheless provides a compelling background. During the final phases of the Ice Age, some regions around the Nile become increasingly arid. Populations may be compressed into narrower habitable zones. A river that sustains life also restricts movement, because leaving it can mean entering dry and uncertain country. Avoiding rivals is more difficult when everyone depends on the same corridor. Richness and scarcity exist side by side. The Nile offers fish and water, but the land beyond may offer little. This setting differs from the greener world surrounding Nataruk, yet both sites reveal the importance of concentrated resources. Lake margins and riverbanks gather people. They create repeated meeting points where alliances can form, goods can move, and hostility can return. The archaeological record does not show constant violence across all communities. Many people at Jebel Sahaba have no clear traumatic injuries, and everyday cooperation must still have been essential. But the proportion of wounded individuals is too high to dismiss as occasional personal quarrels. The cemetery may also preserve the emotional consequences of recurring conflict. Survivors bury relatives whose bodies contain the same kinds of stone points that wounded them in earlier years. They may recognize the weapon styles of neighboring groups. Each funeral adds another memory to the landscape. The dead become evidence within living disputes, reinforcing obligations to defend, retaliate, or avoid particular places. Although these emotions do not fossilize, the repeated pattern of healed and fatal wounds suggests communities unable to escape a cycle of danger. Jebel Sahaba therefore provides something Nataruk cannot. Nataruk may preserve one concentrated episode of collective killing, though that interpretation remains debated. Jebel Sahaba shows violence distributed through time. Its people are not simply caught in one disastrous moment. Some survive earlier attacks and carry their injuries into later life. The cemetery records conflict as repetition. Whether this should be called war remains a question of definition. There are no armies, fortified cities, or written declarations, yet groups appear to attack other groups repeatedly, using projectile weapons and striking adults and children alike. Hostility may persist long enough to shape burial practices, movement, and memory. If warfare means socially organized, recurring violence between communities, Jebel Sahaba stands among its earliest convincing traces. The cemetery does not reveal humanity's first war in any absolute sense. Earlier conflicts may have left no preserved bodies, or their evidence may remain undiscovered. But beside the ancient Nile, violence has moved beyond one broken skull or isolated murder. It has become a pattern carried in healed bone, repeated wounds, and generations of dead buried together beneath an unstable sky. The repeated violence at Jebel Sahaba takes place during one of the most unstable environmental transitions humans have ever endured. The end of the Ice Age is not a single moment when cold gives way peacefully to warmth. It is a long sequence of reversals, regional droughts, sudden shifts in rainfall, changing river channels, and landscapes that can become unfamiliar within a few generations. Communities adapted to one pattern of water and animal movement may discover that the knowledge inherited from their parents no longer works as reliably. The world does not collapse everywhere at once, but uncertainty becomes part of survival. Along the Nile, this uncertainty is intensified by geography. The river is a narrow living corridor through increasingly dry country. Fish, waterfowl, edible plants, fresh water, and game are concentrated near its banks and floodplains. Beyond that corridor, movement may become costly and dangerous. When conditions worsen, people cannot always disperse freely into surrounding territory. The river draws them together even when social tensions make proximity dangerous. This does not mean climate automatically produces war. Drought does not turn peaceful communities into attackers by itself, and wetter periods are not necessarily free from violence. Human responses to environmental pressure depend on social relationships, population size, technology, cultural expectations, and the availability of alternatives. Some groups respond to scarcity through exchange and mutual support. Others migrate, divide into smaller bands, or negotiate temporary access to resources. Violence is one possible response among many, not an unavoidable natural law. Yet repeated environmental stress can make peaceful solutions harder to maintain. A fishing place that once supported several groups during different seasons may become productive for only a short period. A floodplain that provided wild grain and nesting birds may dry before harvest. Herds may follow new routes. A spring may fail entirely. When the number of dependable locations shrinks, communities that previously avoided one another begin meeting more frequently at the same remaining places. These encounters are shaped by memory. A group arriving at a river bend may see it as part of an ancestral route used for generations. Another community may believe the same place belongs within its own seasonal territory. Neither possesses written ownership, boundary stones, or permanent walls, but both may carry strong expectations about access. A dispute therefore concerns more than immediate food. It touches identity, history, and the right to remain part of a landscape. The importance of territory in hunter-gatherer societies is often misunderstood. Mobility does not mean the absence of place. People can move widely while maintaining detailed social maps. Certain locations may be shared freely, others used only through marriage ties, and others restricted during important seasons. Rights may depend on kinship, invitation, reciprocal gifts, or long-established custom. When environmental change forces people beyond familiar routes, they enter landscapes where these rules are uncertain or hostile. The first confrontation may be small. A fishing net is damaged, a catch is taken, someone is struck during an argument, a traveller disappears. In a society without a central authority capable of investigating and punishing individuals, responsibility may fall upon families or entire groups. The relatives of an injured person demand compensation or revenge. If the accused group refuses, another attack follows. Each side then remembers itself as responding rather than beginning the conflict. This cycle can continue even after the original cause is forgotten. Children grow up hearing which group killed an uncle, took a sibling, or attacked a camp. A scar on an older person's body becomes a visible reminder. A grave containing a projectile point reinforces the story that danger comes from a particular direction. Violence becomes inherited as expectation. People travel armed, avoid certain routes, and interpret uncertain movements as threats once fear becomes established. An ambush may be launched not because an attack is occurring, but because one is anticipated. Jebel Zahaba fits disturbingly well within such a cycle. Healed projectile wounds show that some individuals survive earlier episodes. Unhealed wounds suggest that later attacks eventually kill them or their companions. The cemetery accumulates people who have faced violence at different times. This pattern is difficult to explain through one sudden struggle over a single resource. It suggests recurring hostility, perhaps intensified whenever climatic conditions force communities into closer competition along the Nile. Netaruk may reflect a different point in the same general process. Its environment appears richer, with expanding water and abundant aquatic resources. Yet abundance can generate competition when it is concentrated. A productive lagoon becomes a predictable destination. Groups know when fish gather, when animals approach, and when other people are likely to arrive. Control over such a place may offer not only food, but strategic advantage. An attack can be planned around seasonal knowledge. The connection between abundance and conflict seems contradictory only when resources are imagined as evenly distributed. A broad region may be fertile while the most valuable locations remain limited. Deep water is not equally useful everywhere. Fish may concentrate in channels. Drinkable water may be easier to reach at certain points. Trees suitable for tools or shelter may grow only in particular zones. The landscape offers plenty, but not in forms accessible at every place and time. Population growth can sharpen these differences. Improved conditions allow more children to survive and communities to expand. For a time, richer resources support this increase. When rainfall later declines or river patterns change, the larger population remains while the dependable food base contracts. People do not disappear immediately when the climate worsens. They crowd into surviving habitats, carrying claims and rivalries formed during earlier periods of expansion. Archaeologists sometimes describe this as population packing, human groups becoming concentrated within limited habitable areas. The term sounds mechanical, but the human reality is intimate. Camps lie closer together. Smoke from another group's fire becomes visible across the water. Strangers appear more often along familiar paths. Hunting parties cross tracks left only hours earlier. A place once experienced as wide and secure begins to feel watched. Scarcity also affects time. Hunger cannot always wait for negotiation. A group whose children have eaten little may take risks it would avoid during abundance. Stored fish, prepared hides, or gathered plants become tempting targets. Raiding offers uncertain rewards, but it may appear easier than entering unfamiliar country. Attackers may seek food directly or remove rivals from a valuable location. The same action can serve immediate survival, revenge, and territorial control at once. Still, the evidence does not permit a simple claim that the victims at Jebel Sahaba or Netaruk died because of climate change. No skeleton preserves a motive. Environmental records reveal pressure, not intention. People living through the same drought may cooperate in one region and fight in another. Social choices remain central. Climate narrows options, but communities decide how to respond within those limits. Lesser-known evidence from prehistoric cemeteries also shows that life was not defined only by conflict. Individuals with healed injuries, illness, or physical impairment often survive for years, implying care from others. Food was shared. Children were protected. The dead were buried deliberately. These acts reveal strong bonds existing alongside hostility toward outsiders. The capacity for compassion within a group does not prevent violence against those placed beyond it. In some cases, internal solidarity may even make collective revenge more likely. The deepest danger may therefore come from the combination of attachment and uncertainty. People depend on one another, remember the dead, and build identities around familiar places. When those places become threatened, survival and belonging merge. A riverbank is no longer merely a source of fish. It is where ancestors are buried, where children learn to gather food, and where a group expects to return. Losing access means more than hunger. it means being pushed outside the known world. By the end of the Ice Age, communities along shrinking corridors face a landscape in which every reliable water source can become a meeting point, refuge, boundary, and trap. Climate does not invent human violence, but it can concentrate the conditions under which old grievances become lethal. The wounds at Jebel Sahaba suggest that conflict returned often enough to shape entire lives. The dead at Nataruk may record one terrible moment when similar pressures, memories, or ambitions converged beside a lake. To understand why such groups might choose attack over avoidance, the investigation must move closer to the possible motives hidden behind the weapons. The motives hidden behind prehistoric violence are harder to recover than the weapons themselves. Stone survives, bone survives, a fractured skull can reveal direction and force, while an embedded projectile can show that one person deliberately injured another. But hunger, fear, revenge, jealousy, obligation, and territorial memory leave no physical outline in the soil. Archaeologists can identify circumstances that make conflict possible. Yet the reason a particular group chooses to attack another often disappears completely. At Nataruk and Jebel Sahaba, several explanations remain plausible, and more than one may have operated at the same time. Competition over food is the most immediate possibility. Both sites are associated with productive aquatic environments where fish, water plants, birds, and game gather in concentrated zones. Such resources can support many people, but they are not unlimited or evenly available. Fish move with water depth and season. Floodplains expand and contract. Reeds can block access to certain channels. A fishing location known to be unusually productive may become valuable enough that a community returns to it repeatedly and expects others to keep away. This expectation does not require permanent ownership in the later agricultural sense. Hunter-gatherer territories can overlap while still containing places associated with particular families or communities. Access may be granted through kinship, marriage, friendship, or reciprocal exchange. Outsiders might be permitted to pass through but not remain. During abundance, these rules may be flexible. During shortage, the same rules may become strict. A group arriving without permission could be treated not as hungry visitors, but as people taking food upon which others depend. Portable resources may also attract attack. A mobile community can carry dried fish, animal fat, hides, stone, ornaments, tools, fibers, medicines, and containers. None resembles the accumulated wealth of a later farming village, but each can represent considerable labour. A bundle of prepared food may sustain a travelling group through several difficult days. A supply of high-quality stone may have been transported across a great distance. Beads or pigments may connect people to exchange networks extending beyond the local region. Raiding travellers could therefore offer immediate rewards without requiring attackers to seize and hold land. Captives form another possible motive. Small communities are vulnerable to population loss from disease, accidents, childbirth, and conflict. Taking children or young adults could increase the size of an attacking group, replace lost members, or create new partnerships through coercion. Ethnographic comparisons show that captives in small-scale conflicts may be adopted, married into the group, exploited, or killed, though these examples cannot be transferred directly into deep prehistory. At Nataruk, the discovered dead may be only those who were not taken. Anyone carried away leaves no identifiable trace at the site. Relationships between groups can also create conflict without direct material scarcity. Marriage connects communities, but it can produce disputes over promised partners, mistreatment, abandonment, or obligations that one side believes the other has broken. A person moving between groups carries loyalties and tensions in both directions. If a marriage fails violently, responsibility may be assigned not only to the individuals involved but to their relatives. A dispute beginning within one household can widen until two communities treat one another with suspicion. Personal killings may expand in the same way. In societies without police, courts, or institutions claiming exclusive authority over punishment, injured families may seek compensation directly. Gifts, mediation, or marriage arrangements can restore peace. But when these fail, revenge becomes a recognized response. The person chosen for retaliation may not be the original killer. Any suitable member of the opposing group can become a target because responsibility is collective. Once blood has been answered with blood, the other side gains its own reason to retaliate. This creates the possibility of feud violence that returns in separate episodes rather than unfolding as one continuous war. Jebel Sahaba's combination of healed and unhealed injuries is consistent with such a world. People survive one attack, recover, and later encounter violence again. The original cause may be forgotten while the obligation to respond remains. Each burial provides a new center of memory. Children hear who attacked their relatives, learn which routes are dangerous, and inherit enemies they have never personally met. Fear can keep the cycle moving even when neither side actively seeks expansion. A community expecting attack may decide that striking first offers the best chance of survival. Unfamiliar tracks near a camp, smoke across a ridge, or strangers approaching a fishing place may be interpreted as preparations for a raid. In an environment without rapid communication, intentions are difficult to verify. Waiting for certainty may mean allowing opponents to approach children, food, and sleeping areas. Preemptive violence can therefore appear defensive to those carrying it out. Status and reputation may matter as well. Courage, hunting skill, generosity, and the ability to protect relatives can influence social standing. A person who refuses to avenge a killing may lose respect or invite further aggression. A successful raid could enhance the reputation of particular individuals, especially if they return with resources or captives. Yet the evidence for prehistoric status systems remains indirect. Scholars still debate how strongly prestige-seeking contributed to early collective violence, and it would be misleading to imagine later warrior elites and communities that left no sign of permanent military hierarchy. Conflict might also arise from violations of ritual or sacred landscapes. Certain pools, burial areas, animal gathering places, or stone sources may hold meanings unavailable to outsiders. Entering them could be understood as dangerous, insulting, or spiritually disruptive. Archaeology can sometimes identify repeated ceremonial use, but it rarely reveals the precise rules surrounding access. A place valuable for fish may simultaneously be important because ancestors are buried nearby. Material and symbolic motives need not be separated by the people involved. At Nataruk, the attackers may have sought resources, territory, captives, revenge, or several of these at once. The lagoon's productivity makes economic motives plausible, while the severity of the attack suggests hostility extending beyond a brief disagreement. Killing children and a pregnant woman offers little immediate defensive advantage. Such violence may indicate an intention to punish, terrorize, or destroy the social future of the targeted group. It may also reflect the uncontrolled momentum of an assault in which distinctions between fighters and non-combatants collapse. At Jebel Sahaba, repeated wounds suggest a more durable relationship between communities. Competition along the Nile may have combined with inherited retaliation. Seasonal movement repeatedly brings the same groups within reach of one another. Each encounter carries the burden of earlier attacks. Projectiles allow raiders to strike from a distance, inflict injuries, and withdraw before defenders organize. Conflict can continue for years without either side conquering or eliminating the other. It is important not to reduce these communities to violence. The same people almost certainly exchanged materials, arranged partnerships, cared for injured relatives, shared food, and cooperated during environmental crises. Human societies can maintain generous obligations toward insiders while treating certain outsiders as threats. Compassion and aggression are not opposite stages of development. They can exist within the same community and even reinforce one another. Strong attachment to relatives may inspire both care for the wounded and revenge against those who harmed them. No single explanation fully accounts for the dead. Resource competition alone cannot explain why some disputes become massacres, while others end through sharing or migration. Climate pressure narrows choices but does not dictate them. Revenge can sustain conflict but still requires an initial grievance. Prestige may motivate attackers without explaining why particular victims are chosen. The most realistic picture is therefore layered environmental stress, valuable places, social memory, fear, opportunity, and individual ambition combining differently in each encounter. The prehistoric groups beside Turkana and the Nile do not need farmland, stored grain, kings, or fortified borders to possess reasons for organized violence. They already have resources worth protecting, relationships worth avenging, roots worth controlling, and identities capable of separating insiders from enemies. This does not prove that war is inevitable wherever humans gather. it reveals something more unsettling and more complex. Even societies built around mobility and cooperation can create conditions in which killing another community becomes imaginable, justifiable, and collectively carried out. For much of the 20th century, the origins of war were often tied to the origins of agriculture. The argument seemed logical. Farming creates permanent fields, stored grain, livestock, houses, and boundaries that cannot easily be abandoned. Once people invest months of labour in a harvest, leaving becomes costly. Surplus can be stolen, land can be claimed, populations grow, leaders gain authority, and settlements become worth attacking or defending. From this perspective, war is not an ancient human condition but a consequence of property, accumulation, and political organisation. The earliest fortified villages appear to support part of this picture. Ditches, walls, towers, and settlements built in defensible positions become increasingly visible after communities adopt more permanent ways of life. Agricultural societies can support larger groups of fighters, maintain supplies, and organise violence beyond a single raid. Stored food allows conflict to continue even when participants are not hunting or gathering. Leaders can reward followers, demand service, and direct attacks against distant rivals. Warfare eventually becomes an institution, complete with specialised weapons, trained fighters, territorial expansion, and political objectives. None of this is seriously in doubt. Farming transforms the scale of conflict. It creates new reasons to fight and new methods for sustaining violence. Yet Nataruk and Jebel Sahaba suggest that agriculture did not create collective killing from nothing. Both sites belong to hunter-gatherer worlds. Their people rely on wild plants, fish, and hunted animals rather than cultivated fields or domesticated herds. They do not live under kings, maintain standing armies, or surround towns with walls. Nevertheless, their bones preserve evidence that groups could attack other groups, sometimes repeatedly and with lethal coordination. This distinction between the origin of war and the expansion of war is essential. Agriculture may not invent organised violence, but it makes violence easier to intensify, prolong, and institutionalise. A mobile raiding party can kill several people and disappear. A farming state can return season after season, destroy crops, occupy land, collect tribute, and replace local leadership. The first form may be ancient, intermittent, and difficult to detect. The second leaves burned settlements, mass graves, fortifications, weapons, and written records. The archaeological visibility of farming warfare can therefore create a misleading boundary. Permanent villages leave concentrated deposits. Their destruction produces clear layers of burned buildings, broken walls, and abandoned possessions. Mobile hunter-gatherers leave lighter traces spread across larger landscapes. Their shelters decay, their camps shift, and their conflicts may occur far from places likely to preserve human remains. A massacre involving 20 people can vanish almost completely if bodies remain exposed, are taken by scavengers, or lie in acidic soil. The apparent scarcity of earlier evidence does not necessarily mean violence was absent. It may reflect the enormous difficulty of finding it. Only a tiny fraction of prehistoric people become preserved as skeletons. An even smaller fraction are discovered, excavated, and examined for trauma. Fatal wounds passing through soft tissue leave no mark on bone. Wooden weapons decay. Bodies killed during raids may be burned, carried away, placed in a water, or abandoned where erosion destroys them. The archaeological record is not a complete archive growing thinner with age. It is a damaged remnant shaped by chance. There are older individual cases of interpersonal violence. Some prehistoric skulls show blows, and isolated skeletons contain possible projectile wounds. Cannibalism, execution, ritual killing, murder, and warfare can all produce damaged human remains, making interpretation difficult. One violently killed person demonstrates aggression, but not conflict between communities. Several people killed together provide stronger evidence. While repeated injuries across a population strengthen the case further, this is why Nataruk and Jebel Sahaba matter. They move the discussion beyond lone deaths toward collective patterns. Even so, they cannot identify a precise moment when war begins. Human beings have existed for hundreds of thousands of years, and earlier human species lived in social groups long before Homo sapiens appeared. Violence may have occurred among them without leaving recognizable evidence. Chimpanzees sometimes cooperate in lethal attacks against members of neighboring groups, a fact often raised in debates about the evolutionary depth of coalitionary aggression. Yet comparisons with other primates cannot prove that human war is genetically fixed. Similar behaviour may arise from different social and ecological conditions. The opposite claim is equally difficult to sustain. The absence of early battlefields cannot prove that hunter-gatherers lived without organised conflict. Some modern foraging societies have experienced raids and feuds, while others maintain long periods of relative peace. These communities differ in ecology, history, population pressure, neighbouring societies, and cultural expectations. They do not represent living fossils from humanity's distant past. Their diversity instead demonstrates that mobile life is compatible with several possible patterns, ranging from avoidance and negotiation to recurring collective violence. War may therefore be neither an inevitable instinct nor a single invention. It may be a human possibility activated under certain conditions. People possess the ability to cooperate intensely with those they recognize as members of their group. The same capacity can be turned outward against those defined as enemies. Memory allows grievances to survive beyond the individuals who experienced them. Language allows plans, accusations, and obligations to be shared. Weapons developed for hunting can be redirected toward human targets. None of these abilities requires farming. What farming changes is the structure surrounding them. A field cannot flee. A granary concentrates value. A growing settlement offers more victims and more defenders. Population density increases the frequency of disputes while making movement into unoccupied territory more difficult. Inheritance attaches families to land, and political leadership can transform revenge into policy. Violence once carried out by temporary raiding parties can become the work of permanent institutions. This process does not unfold everywhere in the same way. Some early farming communities remain relatively unfortified for centuries. Cooperation between settlements can be extensive, and exchange networks may reduce the need for attack. Other regions show increasing concern with defense. Walls may protect against animals, floods, or social threats as well as enemies, so even fortifications require cautious interpretation. Scholars still debate how rapidly organized warfare expanded after agriculture, and whether environmental stress or inequality played the greater role in particular regions. Nataruk complicates the agricultural explanation because its people inhabit a productive landscape without cultivating it. They may still possess resources worth stealing and places worth defending. Seasonal fishing grounds can function like temporary property. Access may be inherited through social memory rather than legal ownership. A lagoon can become contested even when no one builds a house beside it. The difference between a field and a fishing place is significant, but both can anchor expectations about who belongs. Jebel Sahaba goes further by suggesting recurring hostility before farming develops along the Nile. Healed wounds show that violence enters ordinary life, not merely one exceptional catastrophe. People survive attacks, bury relatives, and face danger again. If the injuries represent conflict between communities, then cycles of raid and retaliation exist without states or agricultural surplus. The scale remains small, yet the social logic of war may already be present. This does not prove that war has always existed. Earlier human communities may often have avoided conflict by dispersing across lightly populated landscapes. Violence may rise only when climate, population, territorial attachment, and social memory combine in particular ways. Long periods of peace could be interrupted by short violent episodes, leaving the archaeological record dominated by whichever moments happen to preserve bone. The search for humanity's first war may therefore begin with the wrong expectation. There may be no first war comparable to the first construction of a monument or the first appearance of a metal tool. Organized violence could emerge independently many times, disappear when conditions change, and return in different forms. One group may develop a tradition of raiding, while a neighboring community relies on avoidance and negotiation. The boundary between murder, feud, massacre, and war may remain fluid for thousands of years. Agriculture does not mark the moment humans learn to kill together. It marks a transformation in how far collective violence can reach. Nataruk and Jebel Sahaba reveal an earlier foundation. Small communities already capable of planning attacks, remembering enemies, using projectiles against families, and carrying conflict across time. The evidence remains incomplete, but it narrows the claim that war begins only when the first seeds are planted. By then, Humanity may already know how to turn landscape, loyalty, and memory into reasons for collective bloodshed. The bones at Nataruk and Jebel Sahaba preserve acts of violence with extraordinary clarity, yet they remain silent about almost everything the living participants would have considered important. They do not reveal the names of the dead, the identities of the attackers, the words spoken before weapons were raised, or the memories carried away by survivors. They cannot tell whether one group believed it was defending a shoreline, avenging a relative, rescuing a captive, or punishing an offence. They show what happened to bodies, but not the moral world in which the killing became possible. This silence makes the search for humanity's first war both compelling and misleading. Archaeology can identify increasingly strong evidence for collective violence, but it cannot excavate an absolute beginning. The earliest preserved massacre is not necessarily the earliest massacre that occurred, it is simply the earliest one discovered under conditions that allowed bodies, wounds, sediments, and dating evidence to survive together. Thousands of earlier attacks may have disappeared without trace. Others may remain buried beneath deserts, lake beds, river deposits, or modern settlements. Even the definition of war shifts beneath the investigation. If war requires states, armies, specialized warriors, and sustained campaigns, neither Nataruk nor Jebel Sahaba qualifies. If it means repeated and socially organized violence between communities, Jebel Sahaba may represent one of the earliest convincing examples. If a single planned attack by one group against another is sufficient, then Nataruk becomes a strong candidate. The evidence does not change when the definition changes, but the story told about it does. The phrase humanity's first war therefore offers a dramatic boundary where prehistory may contain only a gradual transition. Individual aggression can become family revenge. Revenge can become feud. Feud can produce organized raids. Repeated raids can establish lasting enemies. As populations grow and people become attached to productive places, temporary conflict can become territorial. Farming and political hierarchy later expand these patterns into institutions capable of mobilizing hundreds or thousands of people. There may be no single moment when murder ends and war begins. Nataruk occupies one uncertain point along this continuum. The strongest reconstruction describes a mixed group attacked beside a lagoon, struck with projectiles and close-range weapons, and left unburied. The injuries, body positions, and demographic pattern make collective violence highly plausible. Yet the site cannot establish how long hostility lasted before the attack, or whether it continued afterward. It may preserve one act within a war, one raid within a feud, or one exceptional massacre that never became part of a larger conflict. Jebel Sahaba reveals a more extended pattern. Healed wounds demonstrate survival after earlier attacks, while new injuries accompany later deaths. The cemetery remains in use as violence returns. Here, conflict seems to persist within social memory. People bury relatives, recover from wounds, and continue living in a landscape where another attack remains possible. Even so, the cemetery cannot identify the opposing groups or prove that every injury arose from the same hostility. Several rivalries may have overlapped along the Nile corridor. The bones also cannot reveal how common peace was. Archaeological narratives naturally focus on what leaves visible marks, and violence can cut deeply into skeletons. A peaceful exchange of fish, stone, or marriage partners may leave only scattered objects whose social meaning is difficult to recognize. Years of cooperation can pass without producing a dramatic deposit. One afternoon of killing may preserve fractured skulls that dominate every later interpretation of the community. This imbalance matters. The people at Nataruk and Jebel Sahaba should not be reduced to victims or fighters. Most of their lives are spent acquiring food, caring for children, repairing tools, treating injuries, traveling between familiar places, and maintaining relationships upon which survival depends. They laugh, grieve, teach, remember, and negotiate. Their capacity for violence exists within societies equally dependent on generosity and trust. The dead reveal the moment those systems fail, not the entirety of the worlds in which they lived. Nor do these sites prove that human beings are naturally condemned to war. A behavior can be ancient without being inevitable. Humans possess capacities for fear, coalition, revenge, and aggression, but also for mediation, adoption, exchange, restraint, and reconciliation. Different communities facing similar pressures may choose different responses. Environmental instability can intensify competition, yet it can also encourage wider alliances. Scarcity may provoke raids in one region and sharing in another. No climate curve or genetic explanation removes human choice from the story. At the same time, it would be equally misleading to imagine that violence begins only when civilization corrupts an earlier peaceful condition. Nataruk and Jebel Sahaba show that mobile hunter-gatherers could organize attacks long before states or agriculture. They possess social identities strong enough to define outsiders, memories durable enough to sustain grievances, and technologies capable of killing at a distance. Cooperation within a group could become coordinated aggression against another. The most surprising clue may be the similarity between weapons used for survival and weapons used for killing humans. The projectile that brings down an antelope can enter a skull. The heavy tool that breaks bone for marrow can fracture a human head. War does not initially require a new technology. It requires a new target and a social justification for attacking it. Only later do societies invest heavily in weapons designed primarily for combat. The landscapes themselves remain part of the evidence. At Nataruk, a productive lagoon gathers people around fish and freshwater. At Jebel Sahaba, the Nile draws communities into a narrowing corridor during climatic instability. Neither place causes violence, but both shape opportunity and risk. Water concentrates life. Valuable shores become meeting grounds, boundaries, refuges, and traps, where people return repeatedly. Memory accumulates alongside resources. Today, those landscapes are transformed. The lagoon at Nataruk has vanished, leaving dry ground far from the modern lake. The ancient environments around Jebel Sahaba have been altered by millennia of climatic change and, more recently, by the modern reshaping of the Nile. The settings that once gave meaning to conflict can now be reconstructed only from sediments, animal remains, ancient shorelines, and the chemistry of buried materials. The victims themselves remain anonymous. Biological analysis can estimate age, sex, health, and sometimes diet or mobility, but it cannot restore personality. One skeleton is described as an adult male with cranial trauma. Another becomes a pregnant woman found beside fetal remains. These scientific descriptions are necessary, yet each compresses an entire human existence into a few surviving features. Every individual once occupied a place within a network of relatives and companions who knew far more than archaeology can recover. Perhaps survivors returned later and saw the lagoon change by decay and sediment. Perhaps they avoided it permanently. The place may have acquired a name associated with terror, or its story may have faded after the community itself disappeared. At Jebel Sahaba, repeated burial suggests that memory remained attached to the cemetery despite danger. People continued bringing their dead to a place already marked by earlier wounds, binding family identity to a landscape of both belonging and loss. What the bones cannot tell is therefore as important as what they reveal. They show that collective violence reaches deep into the hunter-gatherer past. They suggest that climate, concentrated resources, territorial memory, and retaliation may have helped create recurring conflict. They demonstrate that women and children were not protected from the earliest known episodes, but they cannot identify a single origin, universal motive, or permanent truth about human nature. The first war may never be found because it may never have existed as one recognizable beginning. Instead, countless communities may have crossed the boundary into organized violence under different circumstances, then crossed back when relationships or environments changed. War could be invented, forgotten, and reinvented many times before becoming a durable institution. Nataruk and Jebel Sahaba are not the opening pages of a continuous military history. They are rare surviving fragments from a much larger and mostly unwritten human struggle over how to live beside others. The dead near the vanished waters cannot explain themselves, yet their injuries force the distant past to lose its comforting simplicity. Before farms, cities, kings, and borders, human communities already know both the necessity of cooperation and the possibility of collective destruction. The bones do not reveal which of those possibilities defines humanity. They reveal that both have travelled with us for a very long time. The dry ground at Nataruk now lies beneath a wide sky, separated from the shoreline that once gave it life. Wind moves across stone and dust where reeds once stood in shallow water. Nothing on the surface announces that families gathered there, that fish were cleaned beside fires, or that a group of people met a violent end and disappeared beneath the lagoon. At Jebel Sahaba, the river world also changes, channels move, climates turn, and generations pass until the names of the buried are lost. Stone points remain close to ribs and skulls, small enough to hold in one hand, yet heavy with a history no living memory can complete. Perhaps that is the final lesson of these ancient places. The past does not survive as a finished story. It reaches the present in fragments: a broken joint, a healed wound, a child's bone, a tool carried far from the stone that formed it. From these fragments, the outline of human life slowly appears: resourceful, social, compassionate, fearful, and sometimes capable of terrible coordination. The first war may remain forever beyond discovery. Another site may one day be found, older than Nataruk or Jebel Sahaba, pushing the evidence deeper into time. Yet even that discovery would not reveal the first moment when one community decided another had become an enemy. Such moments begin in thought, memory, and speech, none of which fossilizes. What remains is a quieter image. Water gathers at the edge of a prehistoric landscape. People approach it because all life must approach water. They bring children, tools, knowledge, alliances, and old grievances. Most encounters pass without becoming history. Food is shared, strangers move on, and the shore returns to birds and wind. But on rare days, trust fails, weapons rise, and the ground remembers what people would later forget. Thousands of years afterward, the waters withdraw and the dead return to the light. They offer no verdict on whether war is natural or invented, only a warning that cooperation and violence have long occupied the same human landscape. Between them lies every choice made beside every river, lake, boundary, and remembered grave, and beneath the silent earth, the oldest witnesses continue to wait.